Have you ever wondered why we do what we do, or wonder why do we feel or even think the way we do? Well, whether you have anxiety, depression, or even chronic pain, or struggling with life demands, listen up because we have Dr. Stephen Porges in the house, who will enlighten you. Let's do this. So who is Stephen Porges? Dr. Stephen Porges is a leading expert in the developmental psychophysiology and developmental behavioral neuroscience field. He's been studying the connection between human behavior and the physiology, specifically the vagus nerve. Dr. Porges' work on the vagus nerve opens up new insights to the way our autonomic nervous system unconsciously mediates our behaviors, such as social engagement, trust, intimacy. Simply put, observing your physiological states opens up the windows into the nervous system for understanding human behavior. His fresh perspective on the autonomic nervous system and the link between our psychological experiences and physical manifestations in our bodies has helped improve the lives of my patients who are suffering from chronic pain. Let's learn more about what this theory called Polyvagal Theory means and how it can be applied to our health and even in the treatment of anxiety, depression, trauma, autism, and various other disorders. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you, Les, and welcome to my office at these challenging times, but welcome to my home.
That's great. Thank you. I thought instead of asking what is the polyvagal theory, I thought it'd be kind of neat to discuss several cases that have some commonalities. And I wanted to share with you what the polyvagal theory has done for my patients, meaning that how it's helped them. Let me just start with this and just hop right into it. A lot of my patients, when I see them, they usually see me as the last stop, which is quite frightening if I am the last stop for chronic pain to help them get their life back together. And ever since I started talking to patients about what is the polyvagal theory and how they can incorporate it, sort of a one system, and why they do what they do, I'll give you an example. I'm thinking of a particular patient who came in to see me with a long history of trauma and chronic pain that could not be resolved. And a lot of the doctors basically said, we cannot operate on you, we cannot inject you, we can give you more psychiatric meds. And the therapist she was working with said, basically, we just need to continue to talk about your past and to heal about the past. And not to say that any of those were wrong, but when I saw this individual in my office, this person was sort of in this crouching position. And as I worked with her within that 45 minutes, there was something remarkable that happened, a couple of things. She started to sit up straight and gave me eye contact at that point. And we did a couple of grounding exercises. And in that grounding exercise, I heard a sigh. I wasn't quite sure whether she was bored because she was not showing me any features of smiling. She sort of did one of those. And then I didn't realize whether I impacted her or not. She continued to talk about the pain and the trauma. And eventually when I regrounded her, and there was something that happened to her, there was something that shifted. It's almost like the weather in her changed. That was the first thing I noticed. And the second thing I noticed, she was not leaning forward and crouched. She actually sat back. And I saw her rise and fall of her breathing. And when you come see me, some of my patients, I pay attention to heart rate variability, HRV, and hopefully we'll explain that to the audience here. And long story short, she left the office feeling less stigmatized, less pain, and her states or anxiety was lessened. And she went home and binge watched anything on polyvagal theory. And so now I have a caveat: please do not binge watch like Netflix.
Oh, right. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the value judgment of what people should watch. But the example you give is really a perfect example for deconstructing what polyvagal theory is. What you were observing was that she was not accessible when she came in, and when she, in a sense, her body was not engaging you. She was in physiologically defensive states. But what you're saying when you say you could watch her breathing, she was opening up her ventral side, which was meaning she was becoming accessible. So even metaphorically, we say welcome versus this is a defensive bit. She was opening up her body for proximity. And so people use their body, they use their language, they use their facial expressions, their posture, and all their gestures to convey to the other, meaning you in this case, what physiological state they're in. And polyvagal theory says the physiological state determines whether you can be proximal or whether you're in literally a defensive fight-flight or whether you're trying to disappear. These are three different strategies of responding to the world. But if we become accessible, then the strategies of defense become co-opted. They become strategies for play or for intimacy. So we can move in safety and we can immobilize in safety. But without feeling accessible, without being safe, our bodies use those other circuits for defense. The other critical point here is that when she was referred to you, she didn't have a voice. So you have to really understand what she was craving and what you were providing. You were first of all, you're an excellent, but in any case, we don't have to be excellent. We need to be good enough or adequate. You were an adequate witness for her body to feel that she was being heard. And that changed her posture and the way she related to you. She shifted physiological states because you were a good witness. You were a support. You were not evaluating. And I'm going to flip now to really with the world we're in. Yeah. We're in a world that is a world of evaluation. Whether we talk about medicine or clinical work, people go to see physicians to find out what's wrong with them. It's an evaluation. We go to school, and when we go to school, we don't really go to learn. We go to be evaluated about what we have learned so we can become credentialed. So our lives are all about 24 hours, 7 days of the week being evaluated. And we use words like saying we're in toxic stress or we're in a stressful environment. All we're saying is that our body's in states of defense because cues of defense come from being evaluated, not being accepted. So this woman is now in your office, and for the first time, who knows, maybe in her life or in decades, she feels accepted. She feels heard.
That is just beautiful the way you described it. And what's really intriguing about what you just said, with everything you just said, I train clinicians and therapists, and one of the things I try to get them to recognize is when you make contact with someone, pay attention to your weather, to your system.
Yeah. So the important part here is what you're really saying is the dyadic responsibility, that you're not really responding to her, she's responding to you. So we use magic words in the literature. We talk about mirror and mirroring neurons. Throw those away. Talk about cues of safety or cues of trust. Beautiful. If you project cues of safety and cues of trust and know what they are or how they work, then the person will open up. So we know what they are. We can just look at the mother and the baby, and we see, in a sense, the prototype or even the archetype, whatever terminology you want to use. Or think about people when they treat their dogs. Suddenly this dog goes on its back and its arms up, showing its ventral side of accessibility with a gaping almost smile, tail wagging. It's not that they're being overwhelmed by dominance. They're feeling safe, and they're saying, touch my belly, I feel safe. So it's the same thing as they're reaching out to be hugged. And we're in a world that says, don't do that, because if you do that, you'll get hurt. And in general, if you have done that, you've been hurt, don't do it again. So be careful, because it's a dangerous world. That's the message. And I want to flip to something that is very politically relevant. And this is what's going on with Black Lives Matter. And it's in a sense, what is the message there? The message is to be heard. The message is to be witnessed. The message is the voice. And so we're under this situation where people are, in a sense, pleading to express how they feel. And society pulls back and said, hey, you don't have it so bad. Well, you don't know. You don't know what is it that people feel bad about. They feel bad about being marginalized, about being
Yes.
bullied, and not feeling that the world is accessible to them. So they can't be who they really are, which is generous, benevolent, creative, and good people. We want to be good people. It's in our core.
Yeah. No, I think I love what you said, because there is when this COVID, when we had the first order to be sheltered in from work, and others around the country and the world, what was interesting is my patients with chronic pain, my phone calls, my emails were blowing up. It's exactly right. The threat doubled for them.
Yeah.
And if they were a minority, it tripled, it seemed like it.
Yeah. So the part of COVID really pulls the mask off of, let's say, social injustice. COVID's telling us who are the vulnerable people. Well, it's the people who are financially challenged, socially challenged, have comorbidities, meaning obesity, heart disease. But who are the people who have obesity, heart disease? It's not orthogonal to their social setting. So it's like trauma does the same thing. We learn what it is to be a human by watching what trauma does to humans. It changes their capacity to be accessible, to trust, to be cooperative. So they lose this beautiful part of humanity, which is connectedness, cooperation, and shared goals. They lose it because they're locked into their own survival.
It really is, and this falls in line with the COVID, my patients' trauma. I'm wondering whether when I was in grad school, and I had a great professor that good friends with, Dr. Richard Converts, and when we entered grad school, we learned the traditional autonomic nervous system. Fight, flight. We knew about that, and when you came on board, I believe it was 94, 95. I can remember when you wrote. I remember that distinctly, and Dr. Verts had spoken about it because we had to take biofeedback, and he started to talk about something called freeze. And I'm wondering whether we could start there, because I'm seeing a pattern with a lot of my patients, and this was really, really helpful with a lot of my patients. I'll give you an example. Whether you have trauma, anxiety is what we call it, or just severe depression, chronic pain, I noticed a pattern in my patients. When it gets so bad, they basically shut down and they're in bed. The limbs don't move. Could you speak a little bit about what is the freeze, and also want you to get technical, because I'd like to have some science behind that versus we hear therapists saying you're in a freeze state. What does that really mean?
Well, okay, so this is my own personal journey, not of any symptoms myself, but in terms of the polyvagal theory. So the polyvagal theory basically identified 3 evolutionary stages in vertebrate autonomic evolution. Okay, so this is, to put it in terms, the most ancient vertebrates had a very primitive autonomic nervous system that was primarily a dorsal vagal system running really the organs below the diaphragm. In the most primitive vertebrates, there wasn't a diaphragm, but basically it was a system that said, okay, if you don't have oxygen, you don't have food, let's cut down, reduce activities. So you start seeing this immobilization or shutting down. Or let's say the water gets too cold, so your metabolic activity goes down as well. So you have these adjustments occurring to reduce metabolic output. Then as evolution evolved, you have a spinal sympathetic nervous system that enables mobilization to be coordinated. This is really quite a remarkable system. And this is really where autonomic psychophysiology really was born. It was born in terms of concepts like fight or flight. And psychology grabbed those, and we talk about the mobilization. But we get confused because, when we play, we mobilize. It's not the same thing. It's not aggression.
Yes.
But what's different? Well, if you watch dogs play, you immediately know what's different. If you watch kittens play, you know what's different. They mobilize, but they maintain face-to-face contact or vocalizations. They keep cues that the intentionality of the movements are for fun. They're play. And if you watch people playing, the kids that get into trouble on the playground are the ones that lose face-to-face. So they hit someone and walk away, as opposed to, oh, I'm sorry, let me help you up. So remember, in our social life, all ruptures deserve a repair. And in a sense, they're opportunities for bonding or improving relationships. So the disruption of knocking someone down while playing basketball leads to putting your hand down and saying, "Are you okay?" And you start having this shared interaction of concern, and
Mm.
relationships build. So what we're seeing is that there's another system of facial engagement with the facial muscles, the intonation of our voices and our gestures kind of override the fight flight. And the interesting part is through the evolution of the mammalian autonomic nervous system, the avagal pathway got connected to the regulation of voice and face. So we can literally, as mammals, we became cooperative species because we could project our physiological state in our voice and in our faces, which enabled the other to feel safe to come close to. So unwrap this, we get the issue that if you're a therapist, you're projecting your physiological state in your voice and in your face, and you better be aware of that. So if you had a bad day, if your significant other really got you in a bad mood before you went to see your clients will know that. Teachers are learning that the classrooms in which the teachers have the most out of control kids, meaning more tantrums, happen on days when the teacher comes in after having a bad time with her spouse or his spouse. So the issue was that the issue is this dysregulation and not being present or a good witness. So the evolution of these physiological circuits enable us to communicate our physiological state. And because we communicate it, we actually have a underlying neural system, which I call neuroception, which detects these features. So you, Les, as a super co-regulator, have this wonderful set of mannerisms, of vocalizations, of voice, of gesture, of welcoming, and making people feel that you are accessible. You are expressing the cues. Literally, you're triggering the feature detectors of your clients to say, give up the defenses. I'm okay. I'm here for you. I'm a good witness. I'm compassionate. I am not going to hurt you, and I'm not going to violate your trust in me. And that's what you're conveying in your tone and in your positioning, your posture. You're not saying, "Oh, that's a horrible experience you have. I feel bad for you," and then moving on.
Yeah.
And that's not what people want to hear. They want to tell their story. They want their narrative to be told. They want the narrative respected. They don't necessarily want you to fix that narrative. They're not asking you for the justice. They're asking you for the witness. They want you to be there with them.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely beautiful. I love that word witness, because one of the things that I practice a lot and teach my patients is to be fully aware of shifts in their body.
Yeah.
It's really intriguing because, when I practiced meditation some 15, 20 years ago, I did it to try to get rid of stress, which is funny, I think, to try to get rid of stress and anxiety. And I was dealing with a lot of my own anxiety with the pressures I was feeling. And what was intriguing is when I became aware of the shifts, for example, I've got so good at it that when I notice when there's a mood shift or something just tightened up, and something tightens up, even though I'm saying, well, this person's not a threat, what is going on? I no longer evaluate. I basically go to that spot and try to hear what the body's telling me. It's really intriguing. So I've started to teach this to my patients.
Yeah.
And I've seen a shift. So they tell me what fancy technique will I be teaching them. And when I tell them just to pay attention to their breathing rate, to their body, they go, is that it?
Well, you're doing something, it's eloquent and simple, and that is you're teaching them to honor their body, to respect what their body is doing, and not to, in a sense, evaluate and be angry with it. So the part that I basically try in my teaching, I try to emphasize, is that your body reacts to cues. You're not necessarily aware of those cues. And that's this process of neuroception that is not perception. It's not like I know what I'm upset about, but my body shifts state. The interesting part that you relate is that you're always, or generally, usually aware of that bodily state change. The question is, when that changes, what is your narrative? So what are you using to explain that bodily state change? And a lot of people use it to vent their anger or frustration on the person who's in proximity.
Yes.
Not saying, well, this is very odd. Why did this feeling occur? and can I, in a sense, feel better? So as an academic, I will share with you my attempts at trying to deal with this, because I've mentioned that, in academia, everything's evaluation.
Yes.
So you can be highly successful. It doesn't mean that every paper you write or every grant you write gets a great review. And if you get these stingers, which are hurtful and often meant to be hurtful and often inaccurate, you get a visceral reaction. Now, that visceral reaction has an impact on those around you, like your lab. And for decades, I had a reasonably large lab. And I would say back in the, let's say in the past 20 years, I used to say to my researcher, my group, I said, look, I've had a bad day. Don't read my cues. That doesn't matter. I can tell people that, but they're still going to read it. And the issue is, because you're, as a lab running a relatively large lab, you take on a different level of responsibility. I was a department chairman, and you have those issues too. People don't give you leeway. You are that figure. And so if you're projecting discomfort in your own body, it's going to be read by the individual who's engaging you for their support as if there's something wrong with that individual, that you've evaluated them. I actually reflect backwards. I had a very close friend when I was a faculty member at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. He was a mathematician. I mean, we worked all the time on trying to develop new methodologies to quantify heart rate patterns. But he was a blind person. And I used to go over to the math department, and he used to hold my arm, and we used to walk down the hall. And of course, the mathematicians there were looking at their books and stuff and walk right into them. And the issue is, you start seeing the world of academics as being people who are partially on autistic spectrum. And the issue is, when you are a young, let's say a graduate student or an assistant professor, and you're moving up the trajectory, you see this lack of acknowledgement as an evaluation that you are not important enough, good enough. And it takes decades to say, well, it's not me, it's really who they are. They're really, focused on object orientation of regulation, and that's fine. But I am a very person, and I like to interact with people. And that's why I've always had this kind of strange straddling history where I'm very comfortable as a bench scientist or a laboratory scientist, but my social life is much more, let's say, engaging with clinicians. And it was that way from graduate school on. I was, at the clinical parties, but my peer group was in the laboratory. So it was like these two different worlds. And
love it.
I've always been very comfortable with that, because it enabled me this ability to translate back and forth. But the point I really wanted to make is that our neuroception reacts without knowing why we react, but we feel that reaction, and then we try to make a narrative of explaining why we feel that. And that gets into the circular arguments. So the take home on this is, have you ever won an argument? So we all can say we've never really won an argument, but we all said we've had arguments. We've had arguments that with people that we were very, we love, our children, our spouses, our best friends. And if we've never won an argument, why do we argue? Why do we create that narrative of justification for what we're doing? Why? So in my life, I used to say, can I remember everything and play it back?
I love it.
And the playback, of course, is really object. So as over the decades, as polyvagal theory evolved, I basically summarized in one slide what I thought polyvagal theory brought to the clinical world. And what it did is it shifted the human documentary from a narrative of events to a narrative of feelings.
I think that's beautiful. One of the things I've gotten from personally, I've learned from the polyvagal, because I'm a creature where if I'm going to practice something, I'm going to preach something, I need to practice something. So if I'm telling someone to meditate, I think it's important to be able to meditate. But the polyvagal, I've used it in my life, just to let you know. And I'll tell you, I want to share this with you. When someone gets defensive with me, for example, a lot of my patients don't really want to see me till they realize what I have to offer or how I can help them. or maybe a family member or a friend, I've learned not to personalize. I basically, this is the funny narrative I say in my head, it's their biological defense. And it's gotten to that point where I chuckle on the inside. So meaning not out loud, but when someone is defensive and trying to maybe be disparaging in their remarks, I quietly say in my head, it's their defense mechanism. I basically chuckle on the inside. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very similar to the life that I've been living. When we developed the Safe and Sound Protocol, which is this acoustic intervention, the company that licensed it wanted to advertise it. And I said, well, you really can't advertise it. People will have to want to get it. You can't, in a sense, tell them they need it. The issue was people have to come. It's almost like build a field and they will come to play. The issue is there's a difference between convincing people and people wanting something. So they have to have an understanding of what it is, what the product is. And we're in a world where people think things need to be fixed, and they're fixed through procedures, through medications. And the issue is when we start understanding that the body is doing most of the fixing, the body is doing the healing. Physicians aren't doing the healing, surgeons aren't doing the healing, the body is, and what our job is to prepare the body to heal, to allow it to be welcoming to the interventions, and for the body to incorporate the information to, in a sense, become what it really is. And so in your world, whether people come in with chronic pain, they're saying, I want to be who I really am. And they're saying, take this pain away or take this from me. But they're really saying, I want to be who I am. And they have an orientation that when things aren't right, they can be fixed. It's the automobile repair shop model of humanity and medicine and even education. And the answer is the power lies within us, and the power lies within our neural systems and the ability of those systems to reorganize, to optimize our own experiences. So the goal of polyvagal theory is really to optimize the human experience. It's not to make you perfect. It's to say, these are the resources you have, and they can be optimized if your body doesn't retract into states of defense. So it's the empowerment of the organizational capacity for resilience.
Great. So this then, that talking about optimizing, could you speak to, and as therapists, clinicians, we use words such as chronic pain, anxiety, depression. I have a couple of questions from colleagues and patients because they knew you're going to be interviewed. So I'm wondering, would it be okay if I asked you a few of them from them?
Sure, but let's start with really what you're asking. You're asking whether psychological constructs or psychiatric diagnoses are useful within a polyvagal perspective. And the answer is
exactly it.
they're really not. Really what we're talking about is the body shifting states. And when the body shifts states, you have emergent properties that lead to a lot of these features. So if we throw out the word anxiety and say your body is in a sympathetic state that supports defense, it starts making a lot of other, it makes more sense. And we say, what does that really mean? It means your body's prepared to respond to threat. So now you know what your body's doing. And now the narrative is, that's really great if you're in a state of threat. But let's say you're really not. So how does the body, as learn, or the way I like to use it, how is your body convinced that it doesn't need to stay in that state of defense? And it actually, it learns through the ways that you function with your patients and clients less. You're giving them cues that you're safe, you're witnessing them, you're using through this reciprocal co-regulation, using voice, gesture, and literally accessibility, that their bodies don't need to be in a state of threat to function in your presence. And so they go through what I call a neural exercise, and they're basically putting their toes in the water and saying, that's not so bad. And then it expands. And so what I did with the Safe and Sound protocol was to ask the question, can you trick the body? Can you use a stealth intervention? Can you send cues of safety to the body? And then what will the body do? And I decided to do this through computerized acoustic stimulation that functionally amplified prosodic, the intonations of voices, of vocal voices. So, but the issue is I learned something. It worked really well with children, especially children on spectrum and learning disabilities and learning delays. They became more emergently social.
Wow.
Hearing sensitivities disappeared, language improved. So you start seeing this whole system coming on board, and actually it increased their vagal regulation of the heart as well, because it's an integrated system. However, when I try to generalize this to adults with trauma histories, or even some children with medical traumas, I was totally shocked because the cues of safety had a paradoxical impact. So initially, their bodies relax, like after the first, let's say,
Yes.
half hour, the body said, "Oh, this is wonderful," and then whammo, the body's totally destabilized.
Yes.
And it didn't take, once I saw this a few times, I started to realize what happened. In a sense, the body had memories of cues of accessibility.
Yes.
Cues of
Oh, this is
accessibility
perfect.
were cues of vulnerability. So how do you deal with this? Well, you deal with it in a sense, taking a similar model that Peter Levine did with somatic experiences. You pendulate, you titrate, you allow
Yes.
the
Yeah.
body to resolve.
I
You
love
step
this.
into the water. So you slow up the whole procedure, and rather than 1 hour a day for 5 days, it could be 10 minutes every other day until the body becomes reassured
Oh,
that they're not going
wonderful.
to get hurt. So there's been a whole rewriting of the protocol for people with trauma histories, and there's some amazing stories. I'm going to share one,
Love
which
it.
was of a psychiatrist who couldn't wait to do this. So she got it, and she did everything wrong. She delivered it to herself at home by herself. The issue is always do things. He says, don't try this at home. But the
Oh,
real issue is don't try this without a supporting person near you, because you're
right.
going into states of vulnerability. And she went through it, and she became destabilized. Well, first of all, she was a
Oh,
psychiatrist who used to take psychiatric drugs herself before she saw her first client. So she had high levels of anxiety, depression, all these issues. And she had a young 7-year-old daughter at the time. So I want to put that into the side. So she goes through it once, and then she gets destabilized. She waits a month, does it again, gets destabilized again, waits another month, and does it again. And the
wow.
third time, she comes through the tunnel. And suddenly the world
Wow.
changes to her. And this is what she writes back. And she says, suddenly I understood why people liked music. Then I started to understand the humor in my child's antics. Those were her words. That she started to see, so her child was no longer annoying and disruptive to her. She could see the humor. So you start seeing really in a sense, the maturation of the person as she comes out of states of defense. So she
Yeah.
becomes a mother and a woman of sharing, and a therapist of sharing, as opposed to someone who is, in a sense, not there, disembodied, taking
Right.
drugs, going through symptom checklists, and writing prescriptions. So you see a transformation in the person, which is powerful as her accessibility increases.
That is mind-blowing. I discovered that by accident, but I love your story much better. I didn't realize I was doing pendulation, and so I do this when I started to practice mindfulness with my patients, and I couldn't figure out, this is many, many moons ago when I first started practice, and when I used to bring the defensive down, relaxation, doesn't matter whether meditation, there was a sudden numbing that came over. And so then I decided to kind of, like you said, dip your toe into the water slowly, and the pendulation of from something pleasant to something unpleasant. I go back and forth. And what's really mind-blowing is that was the first time they were able to feel, in some sense, less defensive, to use your words, that they were less constricted. This is when I noticed that. And so I tripped over it by accident. And so the first time I met, I think, or a couple of times when you mentioned, you said you might be a trauma therapist, not that, no, I'm a pain psychologist. And I've now come to believe that I think I am doing trauma work. And
See,
it's just
you're trauma informed or
trauma informed.
polyvagal informed. I don't think you can be trauma informed without being polyvagal informed,
Well
because
said.
it's telling you where the body is, and it's in its heroic journey to try to save itself. So it's
Right.
not that these defenses are bad, but they are limiting in terms of spontaneous social interactions.
Yeah.
They're very effective in protecting, and the issue is the body has to now be convinced that it's a safe world for that person to
That's beautiful.
experience.
Now I've got a tough question to this is coming from a clinician. a clinician who heard you say something about a hybrid between the
Oh,
sympathetic and the parasympathetic.
yeah.
Could you speak to that a little bit?
This goes back to your question on freeze. So if we think about the ontogeny of freeze, so as I was saying, when I started to develop the model, I was talk about it and I would talk about, you know, uh, social engagement, fight, flight, and then freeze. But I really didn't mean freeze. I meant shutdown. And
Mm,
shutdown meant death fainting or collapse, basically fainting or the body not having any muscle tone.
right.
Now, you get those types of descriptions from people who have their first abusive encounter. They basically may pass out, disappear. But what
Yeah.
you start learning is that many people have been abused repeatedly and they go into more of a freeze state and a dissociative state. The
Mm-hmm.
freeze state keeps them from passing out. So they're maintaining a sufficient amount of basically blood flow to their muscles so they don't go vasovagal syncope, they don't pass out. Because
Mm-hmm.
passing out can be potentially lethal for mammals. So they make an adjustment. It's not a conscious adjustment, it's a bodily adjustment. So their muscles maintain muscle tone. So if they're frozen, you see this also in cases, people are bracing and they can't move. So it's a hybrid between a shutting down with, it's more of a dorsal vagal, but it also has a sympathetic component. So that hybrid is somewhere in between recruiting both, because if they went to shut down, falling creates injury and dropping of heart rate so precipitously can actually cause brain damage. So you start seeing these adjustments occurring.
Gotcha. Which then would be great for you to lead into. Could you explain to us what heart rate variability
Yeah.
is? How does it tie into polyvagal, and what could we do as ordinary people to pay
Okay.
attention to that?
So the first thing is my work started with heart rate variability decades ago, and I observed it, I would say, in the late 1960s were my first publications in it, and it was very descriptive. So heart rate variability is actually the term I used.
Mm,
And then by the middle 1970s, I tried to deconstruct what those patterns really were. And I got very physiologically oriented and started to talk about vagal regulation of the heart and respiratory sinus arrhythmia, and moved from using descriptive statistics to starting to develop metrics that represented neural regulation of autonomic state. So polyvagal theory really grew out of initially heart rate variability, but then heart rate variability became a neurophysiological metric, and then the metric became part of polyvagal theory. So the
wow.
respiratory sinus arrhythmia, that is the uh, predominant component most people focus on, is actually part of this ventral vagal circuit
Mm,
or complex, which is the vagal regulation of the heart, but it's linked to the neural regulation of the muscles of the face and head. And another way of really kind of thinking about this, intonation of our voice is also a vagal phenomenon, is through a nerve called the recurrent laryngeal nerve. So
mm,
intonation of voice is a parallel vagal circuit. And if our voice has more prosody, more intonation, in a sense, has more variability, and it parallels respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So in our neuroceptive interaction,
mm.
the intonation of our voices are conveying our physiological state that triggers in the other person that we are safe enough to come close to. Now, we all know this because certain people's voices are like this. They push us away. And other
Yes.
people's voices, we say, hey,
Yeah.
not a bad guy, even though I don't agree with what he's saying. I find him warm, I find him interesting, and I don't mind spending time with him. But if he says the things I like, but says it in a, let's say, we would use a more dogmatic tone of voice,
Mhm.
less intonation, you'd say, well, I agree with what the person's saying, but yeah, I don't really feel that comfortable. And then if a person talks in a high-pitched monotone, you say, what's that person all upset about? So we are reading the cues, and those cues of intonation of voice are powerful in the building of our relationships because they're triggers of our physiological state. And
That's
we have to understand our evolutionary history. So long before mammals had language, and we are the only mammalian species with a definable language, they had vocalizations. It was part of the transition from reptiles to mammals, was a vocalization
right.
communication. And that was how they functionally could identify conspecifics, those of their species, whether they're safe to come close to. Is your physiological state in a state of rage, or is it a state of accessibility? Since I'm not going to go and make friends or try to mate with one that's in a state of
Right.
great aggression.
I think that's wonderful. In fact, my last set of questions were basically just where you left off. So Peter Levine does something where he gets clients to say the word "vous," which ties into. I'll let you speak to that. I also have a lot of patients that I work with in large groups and that I treat, and I noticed something very unique. When I teach a patient long exhalations, just grounding themselves, it works well. But something really is wonderful, which really speaks to the neuro hierarchy, I should say, is that when I do this in a group, and it is something remarkable about hanging out in the group. Now, my patients, I tease them a little bit. I said, we're a tribe, so we're here to support each other. And the feedback I get from a one-on-one versus group, the group, I seem to have the greatest effect. And I wanted you to speak to that with the chanting, the breathing, because it segues into the question of what else can we do to kind of regulate our autonomic nervous system?
Well, even drum circles are the same thing, in part because you're mobilizing, you're engaging, and you're listening. So if you think about what the social engagement system is, it's production of sound, it's also listening, and it's detecting of features in the environment, meaning other people. And often the upper parts of the face is really what you're looking at, and they become alive when you're doing that. I'm going to flip back a little bit to get to Peter and the VU. Okay, so VU, if we go back to really what pranayama yoga is about, or yoga of breath, I always like to say in a simplistic way that pranayama yoga is yoga of the social engagement system.
Love it.
It has all the features, utilizing all the muscles of the face and head, including listening, vocalizing, and often even like going back and rolling the tongue up, which is part of pranayama yoga, and breath. So it used to be, basically people said it's yoga of breath, but it's more than that. It's also with the afferents of the cranial nerves. So pranayama yoga and the social engagement system really kind of fit together. Now, what is VU? VU is a chant, it's a vocalization, but it's also stimulating a lot of the afferents in the oral cavity. So you start creating through breath, through the vibratory aspect of those afferents, a much more integrated and powerful stimulation portfolio or toolkit. And so, it makes a lot of sense. And I would say that it's, it has ancient antecedents. And when we start understanding ancient antecedents and say, well, there have always been smart people. They might have had different language in terms of their metaphor, but they knew that there were ways to regulate physiological state. And they did it through chant, through breath, and through posture. And those are all portals of getting into that polyvagal, or let's say the vagal system.
Wow, I think that's beautiful. And my last, that's just fantastic, because when I was looking at this, when I was studying biofeedback and interventions, I suspended the religion, I suspended all the woo-ness, but just looked at the physiology. I heard one of your lectures, which just nailed it. I think you had one slide that said, listen here, this is just one way to co-regulate, just to kind of dampen that autonomic. It was, when I looked at it that way, I now use that explanation with my patients who said, well, is this, hey, I'm not a Buddhist, or hey, I'm not a Hindu. But when I just basically speak to the physiology, Polyvagal-Informed, it's the defenses go away.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a chapter called Portals to Compassion, Vagal Pathways, Portals to Compassion. It's in the Handbook of Compassion Science or something like that at Oxford. But I'll send you a copy if you.
Oh, that'd be great.
And the issue is, it really says the roots of all traditions, or many traditions, had a lot to do with very similar features of, and even the way that cathedrals were designed, and the large organs that played low sound low frequency sounds,
Yes.
which are really sounds of trauma, if you think about them, but they're used within a context of safety and they become sounds of awe. So they,
Yeah.
in a sense, rather than these ultra low frequencies trigger in our body a sense of uncertainty like earthquakes or volcanoes, and our body gets a little reactive. But if we do it within the context of a cathedral like fortress, we're
Yes.
protected and we can now experience things. So there's a lot of what I would call embodiment experiences that have been parts of lots of traditions that if taken by themselves, they can be destabilizing, but they're put within kind of a, let's say, a sophisticated context that allow people to have this range of experience.
Yeah. All I can say is, as we come to a wrap here, I'm just so grateful for your discovery, how you've actually made it accessible to clinicians to apply it, not just intellectually, but personally, I think everyone ought to be polyvagal informed. It should be part of the census. Are you polyvagal informed? That's another topic. But that's how much I have the passion for understanding the polyvagal has really reduced a lot of unnecessary psychologicalizing, is what I call it. But it's basically helped us be human, and a lot of my patients, and the shaming has been decreased by just understanding what their states are, and they don't have to feel stuck. With that said, my last question here is could you give us, for the audience, my patients, providers, what are some 1 to 3 things that we could do to stimulate the ventral or ventral vagal, or just what are some things we could do practically to get back
To
to balance?
me, we as humans have this portal that was, let's say, a gift, and the portal happens to be breathing, and that's because during inhalation we functionally turn off this protective calming vagus, so we get more mobilized. But during exhalation, that vagal pathway becomes more effective. So we can literally take on and off what I call the vagal brake. So we can experience a mobilization that is not a sympathetic excitation, but just taking off the brake for a while. And that's how most of us more regulated people live our lives. We don't really drive up our sympathetic nervous system. We just take the vagal brake off. And then when we sit back down, we take a nice deep breath, exhale slowly, and we're back focused. But if we don't have that access, and there are a lot of people that we would call tightly wrapped people or highly anxious, they're doing everything on the sympathetic nervous system because their bodies will not allow them to be accessible because that's vulnerability. And so the part of therapy is to, in a sense, re-entrain, re-experience the calming of, let's say, a ventral vagal state. And this can be done through slow exhalations, through titration of that, and also through, I would say, almost a self-internship where we experience it and then describe it. And so we become more embodied, where our narrative now is a more valid indicator of our visceral state. We become our visceral state is something that we honor and respect, as opposed to something we try to package up and throw away because it interferes with our productivity.
Right.
And this leads us to the real question, that is, what is it to be a successful human being?
Yes.
And this is an orthogonal point in all your clinical settings, because people talk about being successful but unhappy, talk about being successful but in chronic pain.
Yes.
And the issue is they have been misunderstood what it is to be a successful human. And this leads us back to our biological imperative. What is our genetic imperative of success? It's to feel safe in the arms of another one. It's to feel that we are part of cooperative units, that we are connected. And if you start looking at people who are, quote, successful, but not, they have resources, they have stuff, but they don't have relationships. So their feelings are empty and they don't feel accessible. So we have to change the narrative of what it is to be successful. And I say this with great passion and compassion because I am an academic at heart. And academics never got it straight about what it is to be successful. So all they talk about is our publications and grant money and citations. Now, the part that I always like to say is that's fine. I've done well in those dimensions, but are those the dimensions that have given me a sense of success, or are those dimensions that have given me the opportunity to be leveraged to have opportunities of success? So I've leveraged those to have opportunities to be successful, which are actually in relationships like the one that we have, Les. These are opportunities of sharing information and optimizing the human experience. And the part is academics hate to make those types of statements and retract to say that I'm data oriented. And,
Yeah.
and we've heard those types of statements.
Yes.
And the point is, data are filtered because you don't just have data. Data are collected based upon assumptions that are theoretical assumptions about what it is that you're trying to measure or see. So everyone's work can be criticized at a different level. So we have to understand the limitations of the filters that we have used to create the data that we use to say we know the story. And the story, and the other part I really want to kind of emphasize is using ideas from the literature, from the history of scholarship, the history of people on journeys to understand the path to humanity, it can be useful. So whether we reach back into traditions of chanting and state regulation or spirituality, or we reach into traditions of science, where people talked about a different understanding of how systems interacted. And what we start finding is that there's a lot of truth or a lot of information there that needs to be reintegrated. And I'd like to talk about what I call a one nervous system model, because we are being confronted by a model that says you have mental activity or you have brain activity and your body activity, and everything is about the brain. The brain is important. The body is basically baggage.
Yes.
And it misunderstands the bidirectionality of our nervous system and the power of the body, the feedback from the body in creating accessibility to pathways in the brain. So the bottom line here is the body has to be in states of feeling safe for certain portals of the brain to work. And in the world of chronic pain, you know that. If the body is reacting to peripheral pain, portals of compassion, portals of higher level mental activity, cognition, executive function, decision making, they're all compromised. And that's what the body is teaching us. It's teaching us that the window of opportunity to access these higher brain structures is totally dependent upon our visceral state.
Yeah, and really, as we come to a close here, there's a word you used in several of your lectures, and I've also heard you in the group that we hang out in, is retuning. Don't say rewiring, retuning.
Yeah. Well, there's a big difference there. There's a real push for neuroplasticity or hacking the nervous system. And this is, again, a very mechanistic, almost medicalization model of you fix something.
Yes.
And polyvagal theory says, no, you don't need to fix it. You need to access the systems that are there. You need to change the state. So it's not a rewiring, it's a retuning. It's accessing resources that are there, but they're dormant because the body's stuck in a state of defense. And so we have to say, welcome back home, get into the part of the body that says, I'm safe, and now I can be who I am.
Wow. All I can say is this is I should kidnap you, take you somewhere in the mountain and just download your brain, because this we could do all day long. And wow, this is just a fraction of it that you've shared with it. And but what's been most important to me here today is your time, and I really do appreciate this. And I just love the fact of how you were able to communicate this in a practical level, because I know the complexity is amazing. And so I'm really grateful for today and this morning, being able to spend time with me, Dr. Porges. It's a true pleasure.
Well, thank you, Les. I actually very much enjoy our interaction. I view your insight and your compassion and your ability to be this super co-regulator. You're one of the models that I like to see in the world. So thank you for being there. And
thank you.
The final point was I would really want to share that my passion or goal during the last, I would say, 15 years has been really to develop strategies of communication. And this is really the frustration of an academic. academics may have insights, but how do they translate it into practice? And I feel really fortunate that there's an opportunity for my ideas to impact on clinical practice. And I really enjoy attempting to translate it into a language that's accessible.
That's wonderful. And again, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart, Dr. Porges. And
Thank you.
true pleasure. And for those of you, I'm Dr. Les Aria. I'll catch you the next moment.